Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the armchair historian for HistoryNet. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was the culmination of several decades of growing enmity between the United States and Imperial Japan. It marked the United States' entry into the deadliest conflict the world has ever known. But why did Japan decide to launch an attack in the first place? Let's start with a brief overview of the geopolitical situation in Asia during the 1930s, when Japanese leaders shattered what had been cordial relations with the United States by showing clear signs of aggression in the continent. Imperial forces invaded Manchuria, a region of northeastern China, in 1931. Tensions escalated as Japan continued bolstering its forces in Manchuria, ultimately launching a full invasion of China in 1937. The US quickly responded by sending foreign aid to Chinese forces. With little hope of improving relations with the United States, Japan switched its foreign policy to one of intimidation. By the summer of 1941, it had aligned itself with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy to form the Axis powers, and the US consequently severed all commercial and financial ties with Japan and imposed an oil embargo. Japan was in an extremely precarious position. It had invested heavily in invading the Chinese mainland, and as a result, it needed as much fuel as possible. However, without access to American oil, Japan had to look for alternatives, namely British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, which had the oil, rubber, tin, and iron required to continue their conquest. There was one problem. The Philippines were controlled by the United States, and if the US was ever provoked, these islands would serve as the perfect staging area for an invasion of Japan, and as a naval base to cut off any imports from coming into the home islands. Thus, the Japanese recognized they had to plan their future Pacific hegemony around American opposition. Though negotiations to lift the oil embargo continued right up until the day of attack, Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo had already concluded that no peaceful resolution could be reached. He instructed his admirals to draw up plans to cripple the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, in the hopes that such a blow would temporarily disable America's naval capabilities. Japan would then have enough time to secure the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies with minimal resistance. The US fleet at Pearl Harbor was completely unprepared for any large conventional attack. Even after the destroyer USS Ward reported that she had engaged an unidentified enemy submarine before dawn, no efforts were made to perform further reconnaissance. Shortly before 8 a.m., more than 300 Japanese aircraft filled the skies, catching the Americans off guard on what had been a sleepy Sunday morning. Japanese fighters quickly targeted the 400 US military aircraft before they could get off the ground, destroying 188 and damaging 159. Similarly, the ships anchored in the harbor were sitting ducks. Most of their crews were ashore. Arriving in two waves, half an hour apart, the Japanese sank or heavily damaged 19 American ships, 8 of them battleships, and killed 2,400 sailors and Marines. The Japanese lost fewer than 100 men. Though the attack dealt significant damage to American forces stationed at Pearl Harbor, it was not nearly as devastating as Tojo had hoped. By sheer coincidence, the American fleet's 3 aircraft carriers were at sea that day, and nearly all of the ships damaged were later salvaged, repaired, and returned to war patrols. Most importantly, the oil reserves stored on the base were untouched, and would fuel Allied efforts throughout the war. Nevertheless, the Japanese did successfully delay the United States from adequately reinforcing the Philippine Islands, and thus were able to capture nearly all of their Pacific targets. But with the war in China continuing to grind on, the Japanese were left thinly spread across East Asia, allowing the US to defeat its enemy in detail. Nearly 4 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese leaders would surrender aboard the US battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, soon after the detonation of nuclear weapons over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thanks for watching. This has been Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, for HistoryNet.